At 37,000 feet, the cockpit went silent, then violent. The DC-10 lurched as its tail engine came apart, and every hydraulic needle fell to zero. Captain Alfred Haynes had almost no control left, only thrust and instinct. Ahead lay Sioux City, a runway, and an impossible landing. Behind him were 296 lives, now hanging on a few desperate minutes. Could anyone bring a crippled airliner down safely? If stories like this matter to you, the ones history almost forgot, subscribe to Final Seconds. A new story drops every week. United Airlines Flight 232 left Denver on July 19, 1989, bound for Chicago, with a continuation to Philadelphia. On board were 285 passengers and 11 crew members, an ordinary cross-country flight in a large silver DC-10 that had done this work for years. The cabin was serving a meal. Families were settled. Business travelers were reading, talking, or staring out at the summer sky. In the cockpit, Captain Haynes, First Officer William Records, and Flight Engineer Dudley Dvorak were managing a routine cruise under autopilot. A fourth United pilot, training check airman Dennis Fitch, was riding as a passenger farther back in the cabin. No one aboard had any reason to imagine that a hidden defect in the number 2 engine had already been waiting inside the machine for years. Haynes had nearly 30,000 hours with United. Records had thousands of hours in the DC-10, and Dvorak had spent years working airline cockpits, men who knew their aircraft and trusted it to do ordinary work. Fitch, also a veteran DC-10 pilot, was traveling as a passenger, not as crew, and that mattered only when the emergency became too large for the people up front to solve alone. At 15:16 to 10, the crew heard a loud bang, followed by vibration that shook the airframe. The number 2 tail-mounted engine had suffered a catastrophic failure. Fragments from a fan rotor blasted outward with enough force to sever critical hydraulic lines. Almost at once, Dvorak saw that the hydraulic pressure and quantity gauges for all 3 systems read 0. That mattered because the DC-10 relied on hydraulics to move the flight controls. The captain and first officer found that the airplane did not answer their inputs. It rolled right and started descending. Haynes reduced thrust on the left engine, and the jet slowly began to level. The crew deployed the air-driven generator and tried to bring back hydraulic power, but nothing changed. By 15:20, they had radioed Minneapolis Center and declared an emergency. The crisis had already reached a point the aircraft was never built to survive. The NTSB later concluded that the energy released by the uncontained failure exceeded the protection built into the DC-10's hydraulic system design. It was not a single broken part anymore. It was a chain of damage, and the chain had already reached the controls. The next minutes were a fight against an airliner that would not obey. At 15:26:42, the cockpit voice recorder began capturing the struggle. The crew had spent the opening minutes checking engines, confirming the failure, and trying to understand why the aircraft was still turning and descending with no control response. At 15:29:15, a flight attendant came to the cockpit, and at 15:29:35 Dennis Fitch arrived too, offering the only kind of help that could exist in a situation like this. About 10 minutes after the failure, Haynes told the senior flight attendant to secure the cabin and prepare for an emergency landing. She moved through the cabin and began the difficult work of getting people ready, trying to keep panic from spreading before the crew knew how much time remained. From that point on, the flight became an experiment in using engine thrust alone to steer a wide-body jet. There was no checklist for this. There was no training for this. The aircraft had lost the one thing that made it an aircraft at all. The crew could still change thrust and trim their expectations, but they could not command the control surfaces in the way every flight had prepared them to do. Even that ugly compromise came with risk, because each engine change altered the aircraft's attitude in ways they were still learning in real time. The minutes that followed were a study in controlled panic. Air traffic control steered the stricken DC-10 towards Sioux Gateway Airport in Sioux City, and the crew struggled to keep the nose and wings where they wanted them. At 1540:39, the captain told the senior flight attendant that he doubted they could succeed, but that they would try. At 1548:43, the landing gear was extended. At 1551:04, the aircraft was still 21 miles north of the airport, and controllers urged the crew to stay clear of the city. At 1552:19, they warned of a 3,400-foot tower obstruction. The crew could not make the steep bank required. They had to choose between turning, slowing, descending, and staying alive. Every change in throttle sent the airplane somewhere else, and every second narrowed the margin. The crew worked the engines in tiny increments, chasing a glide path they could not really hold, while the airport grew larger and the runway remained brutally short for what they were trying to do. Controllers offered vectors, headings, and reassurance, but the crew was still balancing speed, bank, sink rate, and the drifting centerline of a damaged jet with no flaps, no slats, and no hydraulic response. By the late approach, the airplane was still not settled. The flaps and slats remained retracted, so the DC-10 could not slow and sink like a normal landing. At 1559:29, a brace call went out over the cabin. The last approach was unstable, fast, and steep. In the final 20 seconds, the airspeed averaged about 215 knots, and the sink rate was more than 1,600 feet per minute. Just before touchdown, the right wing dropped hard. At 1600:01, the Czech airman warned that pulling the throttles back would make the roll worse. Seconds later, the crew called for left power. At 1600:16, the airplane hit the runway on the threshold slightly left of centerline, first on the right wing tip, and then the right main gear. The DC-10 skidded, rolled inverted, and broke apart in fire. The landing had bought only a few more seconds, and everyone on board knew it. In the cockpit, the last corrections were tiny and urgent, the sort of moves that would have meant almost nothing in a healthy aircraft, and everything in this one. Fitch kept working the throttles until the final instant, because there was no calmer option left. Inside the cabin, those seconds were all the passengers had. Some braced as instructed. Others felt the violence of impact, the floor vanishing beneath them, and the cabin turning into wreckage and smoke. The airplane came to rest in pieces beyond the runway, with the cockpit separated early and the tail section sliding on. Of the 296 people aboard, 111 died and 185 survived. The fact that so many lived was remarkable, but survival did not mean escape from injury, fear, or loss. In the cornfields around Sioux City, rescuers moved toward burning metal and scattered debris, while survivors searched for one another through smoke and broken rows of stalks. Nearby, the airport emergency system and local agencies were already converging on the scene, carrying hoses, foam, and stretchers toward a fire that refused to stay in one place. Some survivors walked out through the wreckage themselves. Others were pulled free by responders who could barely see through the smoke and the corn. In those moments, survival depended on speed, luck, and the fact that the fire crews were already moving toward the right pieces of broken metal before the flames could close every path. The airport emergency response had been drilled before, and that preparation mattered. Fire crews reached the scene quickly and attacked the flames, but the burning wreckage, wind, and tall corn made access difficult. Foam helped create a path for survivors, and local responders transported the injured as fast as they could. The NTSB concluded that the accident began with a metallurgically defective titanium fan disc in the number 2 engine, a defect that led to a fatigue crack, disc rupture, and the release of debris powerful enough to destroy all 3 hydraulic systems. The board also said the DC-10 design had not adequately protected those systems from uncontained engine fragments. After Sioux City, Aviation took hydraulic redundancy and engine containment far more seriously. The airplane still lost. The people inside did not all do so. What remained was a lesson written in metal, smoke, and human steadiness. For the families, the date never became history. It remained a sound, a seat number, a name, and the long wait for a phone call that never comes. That is why Sioux City still matters. Not because the airplane survived the sky for one more minute, but because so many people were still there when it stopped. Every crash leaves behind more than wreckage. It leaves behind story that deserves to be told. If this one moved you, subscribe to Final Seconds, and never miss another. The next story is already waiting.